Let's take an early look at the crash of a Mooney M20J outside of Montgomery County Airpark near Gaithersburg, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C. The Mooney was occupied by two people, and it was on final approach into Montgomery County Airpark when it struck power lines and was held suspended there for several hours while first responders rescued the people inside. They survived, but they did have serious injuries. If we take a look at the flight and back up following ADSB, we can see that the flight was the second flight of the day. The airplane departed Montgomery County Airpark earlier that morning and flew up to White Plains, New York. It was on the ground there for several hours, and then it returned back to Montgomery County Airpark, two people aboard. In the interim, while the airplane was on the ground, the weather had deteriorated both at White Plains, New York, and the weather at Gaithersburg was poor also. As the pilot came inbound, we can see from ADSB tracks there's a couple factors at play here in the conditions for the day. The first is we can tell from his speed going up to White Plains and then his ground speed coming back, remember ADSB tracks ground speed, that he had a pretty significant wind coming out of the south or the southeast. We can also see that in some of his flight data as he's coming inbound to Gaithersburg. Anytime he makes a turn to the northwest, we see his ground speed pick up dramatically, and as he turns back to the southeast, the ground speed will drop off. As he comes inbound, we get a couple clues as to the cockpit inside the Mooney. We can hear from liveatc.net, and we overlaid that with his ADSB tracks, that the pilot seems to be struggling with his internal navigation systems.
1 Romeo Fox, I'm showing you made a northwestbound turn. You can turn left turn heading 240, enable direct to Bedcuff. Yeah, I'm showing you on like a 340 heading right now. For 1 Romeo Fox, you might have it spelled incorrectly. Bedcuff for me for 201 Romeo Fox heading 230 would put you right direct Bedcuff. 1 Romeo Fox, it looks like you made a southbound turn again. You're southeastbound now. I'm showing a heading of about 175.
Now, it's unclear whether or not there's a problem with the system itself or whether the pilot is struggling with his proficiency in the system. Either way, it seems like he makes a couple of turns that air traffic control is not expecting him to make. They eventually do sort it out and get the pilot head in the right direction, and he heads towards the initial fix. As he heads towards the initial fix, from that point inbound, the approach looks fairly normal, what you'd expect from a Mooney in terms of his altitudes and his airspeeds flying the RNAV runway 14 approach. The challenge here is it's nighttime and the weather has turned really low. It's 200 overcast and about 1.25 miles visibility, which is below even the lowest approach there at Gaithersburg. Coming inbound, the pilot actually, it seems from the transmissions we can hear, from liveatc.net, the only thing we can hear are the air traffic controls transmissions. We don't get the pilot's transmissions. But we do get a sense that initially the pilot was planning to fly the RNAV Alpha, or the circling approach. And the minimums, the weather that day was much too low to fly a circling approach. By the time the pilot is calling for the approach, or it's possible that the last weather update he had, the weather was actually above approach minimums for the RNAV to runway 14. He transitions to the RNAV runway 14 approach, and sometime during that period, the weather drops even below the minimums for that approach. It's down to 200 overcast, 1.25 miles visibility or so. We pick up the pilot at the initial fix, and he's tracking it down much as we would expect. His altitudes and airspeeds seem about normal for a Mooney coming inbound on an instrument approach, until he gets inside the final approach fix. And inside the final approach fix, somewhere in about 1 mile span, he suddenly drops much lower than is expected and hits the power lines. We can see from the satellite overlay how the power lines are running through the final approach course there on final to runway 14. Now, if the approach is flown correctly, and normally those power lines wouldn't be a factor, but in this case, the pilot descended too early and hit the power lines. And so The question is, why? What happened after the final approach fix and in about that mile or so span to cause the pilot to drop below normal approach altitudes and strike the power lines? A couple things that the NTSB will likely look at. First, weather is certainly a factor in this accident, with the weather at the time of the accident being so low, very low IFR, and the fact that it's night. So it's nighttime, low IFR, demanding conditions for any pilot, and single pilot night IFR is a challenging scenario. Certainly it's done all across the country at multiple times in multiple different airplanes throughout the year, but it is a demanding scenario and it requires a high level of proficiency from pilots in both their stick and rudder skills and their systems, buttonology skills. So that's one factor, is the weather certainly seemed to play a factor. There was also an air met for wind shear out that day, and we can tell from his ADSB tracks with that strong wind coming out of the southeast, and then the winds on the surface were variable at 4. So somewhere in between about 8,000 feet and the surface, that strong tailwind coming out of the southeast appeared to dissipate, and in there would have been some wind shear, could have been some turbulence, and that could have been disorienting. The second potential issue, the conditions were certainly a factor, and the NTSB will look at the pilot himself and what was his training and his proficiency and his currency level to fly IFR and to fly night. They should be able to look at that relatively quickly, given the pilot survived. They'll eventually be able to talk to him, look at his logbooks, and look at his proficiency level in what was a demanding scenario. The pilot was IFR qualified. He was flying on a second-class medical, and it appears that he had been a pilot for several years. And then finally, the equipment. The NTSB will look at the aircraft and try to determine, was there some problem with the aircraft that caused that descent down to below minimum altitudes. If, for example, he lost engine power, that could be a reason why he was not able to sustain the glide slope on the way down and struck the power lines. If that was the case, they'll look at things like fuel and water in the fuel or fuel management. The Mooney would have had plenty enough fuel if it was topped off at Gaithersburg to fly up to White Plains, New York and back without refueling. The Mooney does have a left and right fuel system, so you do have to manage the fuel from your left wing tank to your right wing tank. This is not overly demanding, it's a simple system. The NTSB will be able to sort that out in relatively short order. So whether or not there was any kind of problem with the airplane, to include the engine, the airplane was relatively intact. We could see that it was configured as it hung suspended in the power lines. The gear was down and the flaps appeared to be full also. So the pilot was configured and ready to land. Aside from the mechanical condition of the airplane, the flight controls and the engine, the NTSB will also try to assess the avionics, especially since it seems like the pilot was struggling with the avionics. So they'll try to assess, was there some kind of avionics issue? Was there some kind of problem that was causing the pilot some disorientation as he came inbound? And also, was night a factor? How was the lighting in the cockpit? Did it work adequately, or was the pilot having trouble reading his instrumentation? Those are things the NTSB will likely be able to look at and assess in terms of the aircraft itself. So this accident is very likely going to go back to the conditions of the day, demanding IFR conditions at night. So the question will go back to what happened in that short span inside the final approach fix in just a mile or so before the runway, where the pilot lost altitude control or situational awareness and hit the power lines. And so we can look at a couple things, and there's a couple lessons learned from pilots to take away from this scenario, whatever the NTSB finds. The first is low IFR at night is a demanding scenario. And we as pilots, as we undertake that kind of sortie, we need to recognize the demands on us, and we need to make sure we're rested, we're proficient, and we've studied the route and we're ready to undertake that kind of demanding scenario. The second is, coming inbound, it's clear that the pilot was struggling with his system for at least for a little bit, coming inbound to the initial approach fix and then the initial fix. As pilots, whenever we're coming inbound to an approach and we begin to struggle and lose our situational awareness or struggle with systems in our airplane or anything that's distracting us from monitoring the approach, flying the approach and flying the airplane, we need to buy ourselves some time. That's a good time to fess up to air traffic control, tell them you're having systems issues and you'd like a vector to clear air if they can find it, a climb back up to clear air, or a move horizontally, a vector somewhere, or a vector to a holding pattern where you can establish yourself in holding, get set up, and then step back, take a breath, and reassess your whole situation, your approach setup, your avionics, and get yourself back ahead of the airplane. Be careful about that scenario. Find a way to buy yourself some time and don't keep barreling down into the terminal phase where things get critical. This accident happened in the last 2 minutes before the airplane landed, and the Air Safety Institute estimates that about 47% or so of accidents happen in the 2 minutes after takeoff or the 2 minutes before landing. So that time is really critical. We need to make sure we're ahead of the airplane as we start an approach, especially in low IFR conditions. And then as we're coming down the approach, we can take from this scenario whether or not it was a factor to make sure we don't transition too early. We can hear from the Gaithersburg Unicom, the pilot made several clicks to attempt to get the airport lights up. He's activating the airport lights. And so as he's doing that, it makes you wonder if he's coming in and beginning to transition out too early, or perhaps he's just activating the lights at a habit pattern that he normally does. And that's about the right time that you would activate the lights. But we want to be careful that as we come inbound, that we don't transition off of the instruments too early. This is especially important if it's low IFR and if the bottoms are ragged. We'll have a tendency to want to pull our head out off the instruments and transition to visual. We have to be careful not to do that too early. And if there's ragged bottoms, we can go back into the clouds, and it's kind of disorienting and demanding to go back to fully flying instruments. So as you're flying down the approach, ragged bottoms or low IFR, be careful. Stay on your instruments until you're completely visual and you're certain you have the runway environment in sight. And then finally, to make sure that we're flying the airplane all the way in, there's a potential that perhaps he got distracted and just slowed down and stalled the airplane inside the final approach fix. One of the last ADSB tracks we have is him at a slow airspeed. We don't know exactly when that track was taken, but it's just a reminder to us that be careful as we're coming down and continue that cross check, continue to monitor the airplane and keep flying airspeed all the way up to touchdown. Stay tuned to this channel. We'll update you as the NTSB releases preliminary reports and final reports, and we'll update you through other AOPA channels as we learn more. Thanks for watching.